It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. That's what everyone tells you, right? Your wedding day is like the pinnacle of joy, the I've made it moment of adulting. And for most of the day it was. The ceremony went off without a hitch. The vows? Tear-jerkers. The food? A five-star dream. My new husband Alex looked at me like I'd hung the moon, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the center of the universe. But the universe had other plans. By the time we got to my mom's house that evening, my fairy tale was starting to feel more like a thriller. Mom had insisted on hosting Alex's family for the night. It's tradition, she'd said, waving off my protests. I mean, sure, her place is huge. Classic Southern charm with wraparound porches and enough guest rooms to host a small army. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement was going to stir up trouble. Turns out my gut was right. It was just past 2 a.m. when I jolted awake. The wedding had left me too wired to sleep, so I'd been tossing and turning for hours, running the day over and over in my head like a highlight reel. The faint hum of voices broke through the quiet, and at first, I thought it was a dream. But no, those were definitely voices. Sliding out of bed, I tiptoed to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was dimly lit, the kind of half-light that makes shadows dance on the walls. I could hear the muffled sound of hushed whispers, followed by the faint creak of floorboards. And then I saw him, Brian, my cousin. He was creeping out of my mom's room, clutching a small wooden box like it was the last treasure on earth. His shoulders were hunched, his steps quick and deliberate, like a kid trying to sneak out without waking the whole house. "Brian," I hissed, stepping into the hall. "What are you doing?" He froze mid-step, the way someone does when they know they're caught red-handed. Slowly, he turned to face me, his expression a mix of guilt and annoyance. Nothing," he said, his voice too high-pitched to be convincing. "Just helping your mom with something." At 2 in the morning, I crossed my arms, giving him the kind of look I'd perfected during our teenage years when he tried to talk me into covering for his questionable antics. "Try again." Brian hesitated, his grip tightening on the box. "It's complicated," he said finally, his eyes darting down the hall like he was sizing up an escape route. "Complicated how?" I pressed, taking a step closer. Before he could answer, the door at the end of the hall creaked open, and my mom stepped out. She was wearing her silk robe, her hair slightly disheveled, her expression unreadable. "What's going on out here?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Good question," I said, turning to Brian. "Why don't you tell us?" Brian looked between us, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Then, without another word, he bolted. "Brian!" I shouted, but he was already down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the house. Mom sighed, rubbing her temples like this was just another Tuesday. "Let him go," she said. "It's late. Let him go," I echoed, my voice incredulous. "Mom, what the hell was he doing in your room? And what's with the box?" Her expression tightened, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said, her tone brisk. "Nothing I need to worry about?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Mom, it's the middle of the night, and Brian just ran out of here like he stole the crown jewels. What's going on?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'll explain later," she said finally. "But not tonight." "That's not good enough," I snapped. "What's in the box?" "Go back to bed, honey," she said, her voice softening. "You've had a long day." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in her tone stopped me. I watched as she turned and disappeared back into her room, closing the door behind her with a quiet finality. I didn't go back to bed. Instead, I found myself sitting on the staircase, staring into the darkness, my mind racing. What was in the box? Why was Brian sneaking around in the middle of the night? And why was Mom so quick to brush it off? The house was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the walls themselves are holding their breath. A soft creak behind me made me jump. I turned to see Alex standing there, his hair messy from sleep, his brow furrowed in concern. "Babe, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice groggy. I hesitated, debating whether to tell him everything. But something held me back. "Just couldn't sleep," I said finally. He sat down beside me. I leaned into him, trying to push the night's events out of my mind. But as I sat there in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that secrets never stay buried. And in my family, the skeletons don't just rattle, they dance. The next morning, the house felt different. It was still the same sprawling southern estate with its wraparound porch and creaking floorboards. But there was a tension humming in the air, like the calm before a storm. I hadn't slept much after what happened the night before. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head. Brian sneaking out of my mom's room, the mysterious box, mom's evasiveness. None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more determined I became to get answers. Over breakfast, the usual wedding weekend chatter felt hollow. Alex's parents were chatting with my mom, laughing over stories from the reception. My mom was the picture of poise, pouring coffee and dishing out homemade biscuits like nothing had happened. But I couldn't ignore the way her hand trembled slightly as she handed me a plate or the way her eyes avoided mine. Brian, of course, was nowhere to be seen. After everyone had cleared their plates and wandered off to enjoy the lazy Sunday morning, I caught Mom in the kitchen, drying the last of the dishes. "We need to talk," I said, leaning against the counter. She didn't look at me. "About what?" "Don't play dumb, Mom," I said, my voice low but firm. "About last night, about Brian, and about whatever's in that box." She froze for a moment, her hands gripping the dish towel tightly. Then, with a sigh, she turned to face me. "It's complicated," she said. "Then uncomplicate it." I shot back. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine as if trying to decide how much to say. "It's not something you need to worry about," she said finally. "Wrong answer," I said. "Brian was sneaking out of your room at 2 in the morning, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. I think I have a right to know what's going on." Mom sighed again, setting the towel down. "It's family business," she said, her tone final. "Family business?" I echoed, my frustration bubbling over. "I'm family, in case you forgot." She flinched at that, and for a moment, I thought she might finally tell me the truth. But before she could say anything, Alex walked in, his easy smile faltering as he took in the tension between us. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, looking between us. "Fine," Mom said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just wedding stress." Alex raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. "Well, if you two are done plotting world domination," Brian just pulled up outside. "Thought you'd want to know." Mom's face paled slightly, and I didn't wait for her to respond. I was already out the door. Brian was leaning against his car, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. "Brian," I called out, crossing the gravel driveway. He looked up, and the casual grin on his face disappeared the moment he saw me. "Hey," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "We're talking," I said, planting myself in front of him. "About what?" he asked, feigning innocence. "You know damn well about what," I snapped. "Last night. The box. The sneaking around. What the hell is going on?" Brian glanced toward the house, then back at me. "Look, it's not what you think," he said, his tone defensive. "Then what is it?" I demanded. He hesitated, his eyes darting around like he was looking for an escape route. "It's complicated," he said finally. "If one more person tells me it's complicated, I'm going to lose it," I said, crossing my arms. Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine," he said. "You want to know the truth? Mom asked me to help her with something. Okay? That's it." "What kind of something?" I pressed. He hesitated again, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to come up with an answer. "It's sensitive," he said finally. Sensitive, I repeated, narrowing my eyes. Brian, if you don't tell me what's going on right now, I swear. Okay, he said, throwing up his hands. It's about Dad. I blinked, caught off guard. Dad? He nodded, his expression serious now. Mom found something of his. Something she doesn't want anyone else to know about. What did she find? I asked, my mind racing. Brian hesitated, glancing back at the house again. You'll have to ask her, he said finally. It's not my story to tell. I wanted to shake him, to demand more answers, but I could tell he wasn't going to budge. With a frustrated sigh, I turned and stormed back into the house. Mom was waiting for me in the living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked calm, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her skirt. Brian told me it's about Dad, I said, not bothering to beat around the bush. Mom's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or fear. It is, she said softly. What did you find? I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and crossed the room to the fireplace, where the small wooden box from the night before was sitting on the mantel. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands, her expression distant. Your father had secrets, she said finally. What kind of secrets? I asked, my heart pounding. Mom hesitated, then opened the box. Inside was a bundle of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. She handed them to me without a word. I untied the ribbon and pulled out the first letter, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The handwriting was my father's, but the words on the page made my stomach drop. Because the letter wasn't addressed to my mom. It was addressed to a woman I'd never heard of before. And it started with the words, my dearest love. I looked up at Mom, my mind racing. Who is she? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom's eyes filled with tears, and she sank back into the chair. Her name was Margaret, she said. And she wasn't just a friend. The world seemed to tilt, and I realized this wasn't just about Brian or the box. This was about my father, and a life he'd kept hidden from all of us. And this was only the beginning. For a long moment, all I could do was stare at the letters in my hands. The weight of them felt heavier than it should have, as if the secrets they carried were somehow tangible. Margaret, I finally whispered, my voice trembling. My mom nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. She was someone your father cared for, deeply. And you knew about her? I asked, struggling to process the revelation. Mom sighed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of years of silence. I found out after he passed. I was going through his things, trying to make sense of everything, and I found these letters. First, I didn't believe it, but the more I read, her voice trailed off, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. I realized I'd only ever known part of him. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my mind racing. Why didn't you tell me? What good would it have done? She asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. Your father was gone, and I couldn't stand the thought of tarnishing your memories of him. But you kept the letters, I said, gesturing to the box. I couldn't throw them away, she admitted. They were part of him, a part I'll never fully understand. I thought about Brian sneaking out of her room the night before, clutching the box like it held the meaning of life. And Brian? Did he know about this? Mom hesitated. I told him recently, she said. He's been helping me figure out what to do with them. Figure out what to do with them? I repeated, incredulous. What does that even mean? Mom looked at me, her expression tired but resolute. Margaret is still alive, she said quietly. My breath caught in my throat. What? She lives in Savannah, Mom continued. I didn't know whether to contact her, but Brian thought, maybe she deserved to know that your father's gone. Wait, I said, holding up a hand. You're telling me Dad had this whole other life, this whole other person he loved, and now you're thinking of what? Hand delivering these letters to her. I don't know, Mom said, her voice cracking, but I can't keep pretending this didn't happen. Your father's secrets are tearing this family apart. I leaned back, trying to wrap my head around everything. Margaret, the letters, my dad, who I thought had been this steady, reliable presence in our lives, now revealed as someone I barely knew. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the letters, the words my father had written to this mysterious woman. I thought about my mom, holding on to this secret for years, and Brian, sneaking around trying to help her navigate it all. By morning, I had made up my mind. I found Mom in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and staring out the window. I want to come with you, I said. She turned to me, startled. What? If you're going to see Margaret, I'm coming with you, I said firmly. She hesitated, studying me for a moment before nodding. Okay. The drive to Savannah was tense, the air in the car thick with unspoken emotions. Brian had opted to stay behind, saying he'd already done enough meddling. Alex offered to come, but I told him it was something I needed to do with Mom alone. When we arrived at Margaret's house, a modest, charming bungalow surrounded by blooming hydrangeas, I felt my stomach twist. Are you sure about this? I asked Mom as we stood at the gate. No, she admitted, but it's time. We walked up the path together, and Mom knocked on the door. It opened a moment later, and there she was, Margaret. She was older than I'd expected, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her eyes sharp but kind. She looked between us, her brow furrowing in confusion. Can I help you? She asked. Mom hesitated, then took a deep breath. I'm Evelyn. This is my daughter. Margaret's expression softened slightly, though she still looked wary. I see, she said quietly. You're his family. Yes, Mom said, her voice trembling. And we found these. She held out the box of letters, her hands shaking. Margaret stared at the box for a long moment before stepping aside and gesturing for us to come in. The next few hours were a whirlwind of emotions. Margaret told us her side of the story, how she and my father had met when they were young, how they had been each other's first loves. They had reconnected briefly years later, but she had never wanted to disrupt his family. I always knew he loved you, Margaret said to my mom, her voice steady but filled with sadness. But a part of him always belonged to me. By the time we left, the weight I had been carrying since that night in the hallway felt lighter. The truth was painful, but it was also freeing. My father had been a flawed, complicated man, but he had loved deeply, perhaps too deeply. As we drove home, I turned to Mom. What happens now? She smiled faintly, the first real smile I'd seen from her in days. We move forward, she said simply. Together. And for the first time, I believed her. The past has a way of lingering, its echoes shaping the present in ways we don't always understand. But as I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace. Secrets had been unearthed, hearts had been broken, and relationships had been tested. But through it all, we had found a way to heal. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift my father could have left us.